This is the introduction to the biographical genealogical theme for the Palolo project. This particular theme and the tasks we have tied to it are tied very explicitly to the names that we see attached to Palolo. This, by virtue of naming, pretty much starts, of course, with the land claims that were made during the Mahele in the 1840s, 1850s, because we actually have those LCA awards and we actually have the LCA names. I've actually already compiled those. So what we need to know first off from that would be when you applied for a land claim during the Mahele, you had to prove one that it was yours. So you have to explain the boundaries, like it starts at this tree or goes to this rock or it's this fence or whatever. You were also supposed to explain what you used the land for. So they would actually say, well, this particular area is in wet fields, or I plant dalo here, or I have cattle, or whatever it might be going on, or maybe a house there. This is an incredibly rich resource that really doesn't get enough use. So these are what we call the native and foreign testimony records. And what we need first is to actually have people dredge into the actual land claim awards and dig up what the actual testimony records were for those land claim awards. There will also frequently be a list of land claims that weren't approved. Some cases we actually have, there's records attached to those in terms of testimony. In other cases they're not. We need to have them all sort of checked off that we've looked. And for many folks, at least in this part of the island, this is true most of Oahu, I noticed that most of the claimants here, the Palolo claim is only one of a number of claims. Lunalilo, for example, one of the monarchs, actually had a claim in Palolo, but I'm sure that was one of, I think, 46 different claims he had. So we don't need a lot of detail on the other claims, but we need to have, some sort of a summary. What were the other claims? Where were they? How does the Palolo claim fit into that? And now one of the other parts that is going to be a little, I'm not sure if it's going to be necessarily tricky, but it would require some thought. You probably have to ask our Hawaiian specialty librarian to help. What happened to those claimants in terms of their Palolo claims? I don't know that any of the folks that got land in the 1840s, 1850s through the Mahele, if their descendants still own property in Palolo. Given the history of Mahele claims, it's a pretty good bet they don't. If not, then what happened? Where did the land go? Where did it move from that individual? How did it move to homes, or what happens with the property now? In other words, what was the history of that property, both during the time that it was given to them in the Mahele and what happened afterwards? Now, we know also that there's some references, at least in the 1993 work on Palolo, that there were some other large post-Mahele landowners. There's a couple of references to one of the Cook family, as in Castle and Cook, owning property in Pukele in the back, but I'm not sure where that property is, and it doesn't show up, at least visibly in the records that I looked at. So we need to have that dug up. There's also reference that Tong, who's a real famous architect here in the 20th century, had a house, or had his house in Pukele in the back of Palolo. I suspect on Lai Road, but again, I'm not sure where, and I'm not sure what it was. Is it still there? So like the LCA awards from earlier, who were the well-known owners of property here in Palolo, and what happened to their property? Is it still held by them, for example, today? Now, this also includes Monolai Heights, Wilhelmina Rise, because all of that was owned by Matson, as in Matson Navigation. He bought that whole hillside. So, in fact, the street names on there are still actually the ships that his company owned in the 20th century. So in that particular situation also, what happened to all those properties? We know that there's a large, what used to be residence up in the back, which is now a nursing home, which belonged to either him or one of the Cook or Castle family. To be honest, I don't remember right now. So we need to have that looked into about land ownership, where it came from. Now, also, of course, St. Louis Heights is very much the same thing. The Marianists actually bought St. Louis Heights when they bought the land for this campus. So what was the procedure by which that turned into subdivisions? So who were your major landowners here? And what happened over time to those? Now, to a lesser extent, we don't really want to, there is probably a little bit of information on the individual landowners in the valley. You can find that in Zillow, for example, who owns each house. But we're actually more interested in sort of the patterns of ownership. We know, for example, that the Carlos Long subdivision was marketed for Japanese American veterans. And my suspicion is, just if you look through that subdivision, that a lot of those folks still own the property that actually bought it in, say, 1945, 1950. I'm not too sure about the property in the rest of Palolo. So one thing we want to look into, but I'm not sure how we're going to do it, to be honest, would be length of ownership. And I think maybe the ownership records might actually say how long the family has owned the property. So rather than actually going to individual histories, to actually compile length of ownership for the different residential properties in the valley. So that's going to be a long project, or a long task on this project. So as with all the other themes, this is very much a sort of detective investigation. The stuff's not available in print in the sense that there's actually one reference you can pull the stuff up from. You're going to have to go and look around for it different places. Some should be available. Some might involve, contacting, for example, Castle and Cook family, I think, have an archivist or a historian. So actually contacting that individual or that group and finding out from them what's going on. Someone at the UH School of Architecture might know something about Tong, the architect, and where he lived and what that was about. So again, this is going to involve a fair amount of detective work in terms of, figuring out who you're going to ask, where you're going to get the information from. You're not just going to look at one thing and compile the stuff up. So I think it's going to be a very interesting particular set of tasks available in this theme, but it's going to require a fair amount of thought in terms of how you use your time when you're looking at these.